Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. I hope you're doing well, and if you're not, I hope you are soon. Okay, there's one thing I really do like about Deities and Demigods, the Cyclopedia of Gods and Heroes from Myth and Legend. And this is, of course, a supplement for Advanced D&D published by TSR and originally published in 1980, co-written by James M. Ward, who recently passed away. So thank you, Mr. Game Man, for all of your amazing stuff. But the thing that I really do like about this supplement is the section on the Cthulhu Mythos. So this says here that the Cthulhu Mythos was first revealed in a group of related stories by the American writer H.P. Lovecraft. Beginning with the Call of Cthulhu in Weird Tales, Lovecraft began referring in his horror stories to a pantheon of beings known as the Old Ones, who had descended to Earth from the stars in pre-human times. First worshipped by the non-human races of the planet, the Old Ones were later banished or locked away by the Elder Gods. The Elder Gods do not enter into the stories much, and their identity is a mystery. They left the Old Ones weakened but not destroyed. When man appeared, he found traces of the older civilizations and remnants of the pre-human races. Religions grew up around the Old Ones and legends of their imminent return to power, especially around Cthulhu. Bits of the old lore were discovered and transcribed into books, extremely dangerous books. So this is a really cool section because if you think about the time that this was published in 1980, coming across this kind of information was pretty rare. Gamers couldn't just turn to Wikipedias online or Cthulhupedias or Lovecraftopedias and find all of this really cool kind of information about these weird creatures to incorporate them in their games. And even though 1980 was closer to the time that these original stories were published, those original stories back then were a little harder to get because you had to rely on mail-in order forms from publications like Arkham House. And you couldn't just hop on eBay to track down your favorite old copies of Weird Tales or your favorite old anthologies of weird fiction. And so having it collected in something like this was very valuable. And so I think there was a time when these kinds of source books were more valuable than maybe they are now, at least in terms of the kind of data that they provided. Now, I've said before on the channel that I was not allowed to play D&D. I was about 6 years old when this came out in 1980, and that was right during the middle of the first Satanic Panic that was gripping American households, or at least some American households. And for my household, it was unfortunately gripped by that Satanic Panic, and D&D was a big no-no. I could experience other kinds of fantasy worlds, and I did, but D&D was deemed too evil for my eyes. Later, of course, that was lifted, and my parents realized how silly the Satanic Panic was, but that is a story for another day. But in Deities and Demigods, we get a whole bunch of different myths and legends and lores, and it's kind of packaged together in these different mythos. And today we're just going to take a look at the Cthulhu Mythos. So we have all of our stats and information for these great elder ones, these great older gods, these outer gods, and all of a big selection of the Cthulhu pantheon here, or the Lovecraftian pantheon. And of course, that was also added to by authors like Clark Ashton Smith, Frank Belknap Long, Robert Bloch, whom I really enjoy, Robert E. Howard, and August Derleth. Those were kind of like the core crew of the original Lovecraft circle. And then we also had authors like Lynn Carter, Ramsey Campbell, and my personal favorite author of Cthulhu Mythos stories, Brian Lumley. I am a huge Brian Lumley fan. But here we have our stats for Cthulhu. Cthulhu is a greater god with an armor class of 2, 400 hit points, and he does 30 attacks there. And I think this is pretty funny. Cthulhu usually attacks both physically and psionically. He can regenerate 10 hit points per melee round, and he teleports up to 1/2 mile at will and is totally immune to the effects of water. I think it's funny imagining Cthulhu teleporting around. And here we have Azathoth, the center of the universe, the blind idiot god. And hey, if Azathoth dies, doesn't everything disappear? So he has an armor class of a -2. He's a greater god. Again, 400 hit points. Azathoth is a blind, mindless, amorphous mass the size of a star floating at the center of the universe on the astral plane. And here we have a Byakhee, who is a servant of Hastur, and Hastur the Unspeakable, he who must not be named, master of the air. I believe it was Derelith who kind of assigned some of these entities their elemental counterparts. So we have Hastur, the master of the air, and Cthulhu, the master of fire, the fire elemental. But Byakhees are giant, furry, bat-like creatures that have humanoid legs that enable them to stand like men. Cthulhu, this creature resembles a flaming amoeba with tentacles that appear to be flames emanating from its body. We have Cthulhu's flame creature, the Great Race. They are very rare creatures. These creatures populated the world eons ago, and their cities still exist, buried in the deserts or other out-of-the-way places. Of course, the Deep Ones here. The Deep Ones are humanoid, amphibious fishmen, cold-blooded creatures of strength of an 18. They can attack with their clawed, webbed hands, or they can wield weapons. And here we have Ithaquah, the Lord of the Air. So Hastur was assigned the Master of the Air, but Ithaquah, the Lord of the Air. So Ithaquah is kind of an interesting elder god, an interesting entity here in this pantheon. I never really enjoyed Ithaquah until I read a story by Brian Lumley, and that story is called Born of the Winds, and that was originally published in this Arkham House book here called The Horror at Oakdean and others, and it has been published in other collections since then. If you were to ask me what my all-time favorite Mythos story was, it would probably be that Brian Lumley story. I think it's just fantastic. And it really made me kind of appreciate Ithaquah a little more in the pantheon here. And so here we have the Migo, the fungi from Yuggoth. These red bat-winged creatures somewhat resemble lobsters in that they have many legs, feelers, and eye stalks, and forearms that end in great pincers. Migos are also very rare. And here we have Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, the messenger of the gods. I think Robert Bloch has some really good stories about Nyarlathotep. I like his stories about this entity quite a bit. Only 200 hit points, so hey, less than half the hit points that Cthulhu and Azathoth have. But Nyarlathotep appears as a tall, dark man. He actually has a lot of disguises. Many masks does he wear. His appearance in the world is said to foretell the return of the old ones from their imprisonment. He's one of the only gods that really has a lot of interaction with mankind. And here we have one of the primordial ones. These creatures are barrel-shaped cylinders. So these were the elder ones, I believe, as called in Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. And here we have Shoggoth, originally created by the primordial ones, or the elder ones there. As servants, the Shoggoths eventually rebelled and destroyed the civilization of their masters. And these are also very rare, an armor class of 1. They can, let's see, how many attacks do they have? 2, only 2. So hey, you could, compared to Cthulhu there, they're pretty weak. And then we have Shub-Niggurath, of course, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, a lesser god. This fountain of uncleanliness is a huge pool of gray matter, 100 feet across in the caverns beneath Mount Vermathodoreth. It is constantly bubbling and putting forth mouths, limbs, pseudopods, and whole creatures. And here we have Yog-Sothoth, the key and guardian of the gate. And famously, of course, Lovecraft wanted to call his pantheon or his collection of myths and legends Yog-Sothothery. And I'm never quite sure if he was serious about that or if that was one of Lovecraft's weird kind of little jokes. But Yog-Sothothery, I think the Cthulhu Mythos probably rolls off the tongue a little bit more. And then we get a little bit of information about the Elder Sign and the Necronomicon. So it's a really short section. It's only a few pages, but I like it. I like seeing this kind of historical document here. Famously, there were some copyright conflicts between TSR, Arkham House, and Chaosium. And I believe this is the first edition, and so it does not attribute this information to Chaosium. But if I'm remembering correctly, they ended up keeping some of this in here, but then attributing the copyright ownership to Chaosium. Because I think at the time, something like Arkham House thought they still owned the copyright, but they had already given it to Chaosium when TSR had asked about this. And so there was some kind of confusion. But this book here was actually donated to the Dungeon Dive somewhat recently, just a couple years ago. And because I never owned it growing up, I was never allowed to. I really enjoyed reading through this, and I liked that section on the Cthulhu Mythos. And that is one thing that I like about Deities and Demigods. Let me know what you guys like about this book. We will talk to you later. Bye-bye.